This is the Athlete Within podcast. I'm Kate Allgood. This podcast is about understanding what actually happens internally when you compete, especially when the pressure rises. Because performance isn't just about what you're capable of, it's about what you can access when it matters. And over time, learning how to stay steady under pressure so you can play freely. There's a moment a lot of athletes know intimately, but almost nobody talks about clearly. You're capable in practice, you've shown flashes of what you can do. Sometimes you even dominate. Things feel natural, fluid, instinctive. You're not overthinking. Your reactions are clean. Your timing is there. You're connected to yourself. Then competition comes, or a bigger moment arrives, such as a coach is watching, expectations rise, the game matters more, the stakes feel heavier, and suddenly something shifts. Your body tightens, your thoughts speed up, your awareness becomes crowded. You start trying to guide things that normally happen naturally. You hesitate on decisions you usually make instantly. You become aware of mechanics that are normally automatic. You start monitoring yourself while trying to perform. You feel urgency, pressure, sometimes even panic underneath the surface. And the version of you that exists in practice suddenly doesn't fully show up in competition. For a lot of athletes, this becomes deeply confusing because they know they're capable. They've seen it. Coaches have seen it. Teammates have seen it. Parents have seen it. There are moments where everything is there, which creates one of the hardest internal experiences in sport. When you know what you can do, but you can't consistently access it when it matters most. And over time, many athletes quietly begin interpreting that experience the wrong way. They might think that maybe I'm mentally weak, maybe I don't have confidence, maybe I'm not built for pressure, or maybe I just don't have what it takes. But what if that's not actually what's happening? What if pressure changes performance not because ability disappears, but because pressure changes access to it? That idea sits underneath so much of the work I do with athletes, because one of the biggest misconceptions in sport is that pressure only affects emotions. We think pressure means nerves, anxiety, fear, stress, but pressure changes far more than emotion. Pressure changes attention, perception, decision-making, muscle tension, timing, breathing, awareness. It changes how athletes process information. It changes how they interpret mistakes. It changes their relationship with uncertainty, with expectations, with themselves. And the difficult part is that most athletes don't fully understand this while it's happening. They just feel different, disconnected, tight, rushed, hesitant, over-aware, which is why these experiences become so personal. Athletes assume the performance change says something about who they are, instead of understanding that pressure may simply be altering the system underneath performance. I think about this all the time with athletes who say things like, I don't know why I can't just play like I do in practice, or I know I'm capable, I just can't seem to bring it out consistently, or the harder I try, the worse it gets. The last one is especially important because one of the most common reactions to pressure is force. More trying, more tension, more urgency, more control, more thinking. And in many sports, the harder athletes try to force performance, the further they move away from the state that performance actually depends on. Not because effort is bad. Effort matters deeply. Preparation matters. Discipline matters. But there's a difference between committed effort and over-control, and many athletes don't realize when they've crossed that line. You see it in athletes who suddenly become mechanical in competition, their movement loses rhythm, timing changes, creativity disappears, decision-making slows down because they're trying to consciously manage everything at once. Instead of performing, they're monitoring themselves performing. That's exhausting. And it's one of the reasons athletes often leave competition mentally drained even when the physical demand wasn't unusually high, because internally they were carrying constant tension, constant evaluation, constant monitoring. I think overthinking gets misunderstood a lot in sport. Most people talk about it like it's simply a mindset issue, but overthinking is often an attempt at protection. The athlete is trying to prevent mistakes, trying to maintain control, trying to avoid failure, embarrassment, disappointment, judgment, loss of identity, loss of opportunity. The mind starts tightening around outcomes because something feels important. Which is why caring deeply can sometimes create more pressure, not less. And athletes often feel shame around that. They think, if I were mentally tougher, I wouldn't feel this way. But many times the athlete is struggling precisely because they care deeply, because the sport matters, because identity has become attached to performance, because expectations have grown, because there's something meaningful on the line. That doesn't mean caring is bad, but it does mean the relationship with pressure becomes incredibly important, because pressure itself is not the enemy. Pressure is part of meaningful performance. It shows up anywhere something matters: competition, opportunity, growth, exposure, expectations. Pressure isn't proof something is wrong. It's often proof that something matters to you. The question becomes, what happens internally when pressure arrives? For some athletes, attention narrows too much. They become hyper-focused on mechanics, mistakes, outcomes, consequences. They start trying to avoid errors instead of staying connected to the moment itself. For other athletes, attention becomes too broad. They begin taking in everything at once: the crowd, rankings, scouts, parents, future implications, social pressure, what happens if they fail, what happens if they disappoint people. Their awareness becomes overloaded. And somewhere in the middle of that shift, athletes lose connection to the present moment, not because they suddenly became incapable, but because their attentional system changed under pressure. I think this is one of the most misunderstood parts of performance. Athletes are often training physical skill constantly, but not understanding the internal conditions that allow those skills to remain accessible under stress or pressure, because access is state dependent. The athlete you are when relaxed, clear, grounded, and connected is not necessarily the athlete you become when overwhelmed internally. And if athletes don't learn how pressure affects their system, they often spend years blaming themselves instead of learning how to work with what's actually happening. I've seen this at every level: youth athletes, collegiate athletes, professional athletes. Athletes that externally look incredibly composed while internally they're battling enormous instability. Athletes who appear confident until one mistake shifts everything. Athletes who dominate practice environments but tighten the moment evaluation enters the picture. And one thing that becomes very clear over time is that performance is deeply connected to internal relationships. Your relationship with pressure, your relationship with mistakes, your relationship with expectations, your relationship with uncertainty, your relationship with success, your relationship with yourself. Because underneath performance, there's always an internal experience happening. And I think athletes often underestimate how much energy is consumed by internal resistance. Fighting emotions, fighting pressure, fighting mistakes, fighting thoughts. Trying to eliminate discomfort instead of learning how to remain functional within it. That's an important distinction. Because high performers are not people who never experience pressure. They're often people who have developed greater capacity to remain connected to themselves while pressure is present. That's very different. A lot of athletes are unknowingly waiting for confidence before they trust themselves, waiting to feel perfect internally before they perform freely. But competition rarely works that way. Pressure often arrives first. Uncertainty arrives first. Adrenaline arrives first. The goal is not becoming somebody who never feels pressure. The goal is developing the ability to stay connected to your game while pressure exists. And I think this is where many conversations around confidence become incomplete, because confidence gets treated like a personality trait, something you either have or don't have. But many times confidence is actually connected to access. When athletes are regulated, clear, present, and connected, confidence naturally becomes more available. When attention fragments and the nervous system destabilizes, confidence often disappears alongside it. Which is why athletes can feel incredibly confident one day and completely disconnected the next. Not because their talent vanished overnight, but because their internal state changed. That's why this podcast exists, not to give surface-level motivation, not to tell athletes to just think positive, not to eliminate nerves or pressure, but to better understand what actually happens internally when the stakes rise, and how to train the capacities that allow your best to stay available under pressure. Because often the goal isn't becoming somebody different, it's learning how to stay connected to what's already there when pressure rises. Over this season, we're going to explore things like attention, self-regulation, self-trust, overthinking, confidence, identity, emotional stability, internal pressure, and playing freely under stress or pressure. But not from the perspective of hacks or quick fixes. We're going to look deeper at the systems underneath performance, the patterns athletes experience internally but often struggle to articulate clearly. And I think one of the reasons athletes feel so alone in these experiences is because externally everyone mostly sees the performance. They see the score, the stats, the outcome. They don't see the internal noise. They don't see the fear of mistakes. They don't see the overcorrection after failure. They don't see the pressure athletes place on themselves internally. They don't see the exhaustion that can come from constantly monitoring your own performance. And sometimes athletes themselves don't fully understand what's happening either. They just know, I'm not performing like myself. But once athletes begin understanding that pressure changes systems, not just confidence, something important starts happening. The experience becomes less shameful, less personal, less confusing. There's more clarity, more self-awareness, more compassion, and from there, real training can begin. Not training to become fearless, not training to eliminate pressure, but training the capacities that help you remain stable enough for your ability to stay available when the environment becomes demanding. Because pressure will always exist in meaningful performance. The real question is, can you stay connected to yourself when it does? If something in this episode resonated with you or helped you better understand your own experience in competition, then that awareness matters. Because the more clearly you understand what's happening internally under pressure, the more intentionally you can begin to work with it. And that's what we'll keep building on throughout this season. This is The Athlete Within.